Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's virtual event with Brookline Booksmith, featuring Serena Parekh for her book, No Refuge, Ethics and the Global Refugee Crisis, in conversation with Patricia Williams. My name is Alex. I'm the events director at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Mass. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. We're very happy to have you here, even if it has to be in this virtual space. If this is the first time you're ever even hearing about us, welcome. We're really happy to have you as part of our community this evening. And we appreciate the support all of you are showing to the authors and to us, an independent bookstore, through your attendance and your purchases of books. The chat and question box are open tonight, so feel free to make use of those. Remember to set your chat to all panelists and attendees if you would like to talk to other attendees. And please drop your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat. That's at the bottom of your Zoom window. They'll be lost if they're in the chat, but we'll be very happy to get to them if they're in that Q&A box. Please note that Brookline Booksmith has a strict policy against abusive behavior and language, and at our discretion, any attendee can be removed from an event for partaking in such behavior. Moderating the conversation this evening is Patricia Williams, who is University Professor of Law and Humanities at Northeastern. She's the author of many books, including The Alchemy of Race and Rights, and is a regular contributor to The Nation magazine. Educated at Wellesley and Harvard and a recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship, Williams is a legal scholar based in critical race theory, whose work has received distinction for the past 4 decades. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I know this is going to make this just an incredible conversation. Our author this evening, Serena Parekh, is an associate professor of philosophy at Northeastern University in Boston, where she is the director of the Politics, Philosophy, and Economics program and is co-editor of the journal Feminist Philosophy Quarterly. Her primary philosophical interests are in social and political philosophy, feminist theory, and continental philosophy. She's the author of 3 books, including this most recent book, No Refuge, Ethics in the Global Refugee Crisis, published by Oxford University Press this year. Other books include Refugees and the Ethics of Forced Displacement and Hannah Arendt and the Challenge of Modernity, A Feminology of Human Rights, which was translated also into Chinese. Her work addresses the broad strokes of human suffering and ethical responsibility by uplifting the lives of individuals whose experiences are not only crucial as each individual is crucial, but which illustrate the global forces that dehumanize them. In No Refuge, Parekh provides an accessible and eloquent explanation of ethical approaches to the global refugee crisis. The book includes numerous stories and first-person accounts from refugees, including those for whom the already perilous existing options for refugees are not options at all. A key feature of the human mind is that we react in proportion to the proximity something has to us. An accident we witness is not the same as an accident we hear about on the news in another country. An illness we have never had is not as harrowing to hear about as one we have lived through. It's a cushion between us and the overwhelming, but the results not infrequently include an inability to grapple with the scale, the intimacy, and the realness of other people's suffering, especially when it occurs en masse and to strangers. It is also difficult for anyone who's experienced these things to fully convey their profound complexity and impact to those who have not. Frankly, describing the pitfalls and incredible risk of refugees' limited choices between refugee camps, urban settlements, and dangerous asylum journeys, Parekh gives depth and dimension to the ethics of the global refugee crisis. Here she not only gives voice to the extent and complexity of refugee struggles, but provides original and lucid ways of thinking about our moral obligations to refugees. It's a pleasure to have 2 incredible scholars with us tonight. Please welcome Serena Parekh and Patricia Williams.
Thanks so much for that lovely introduction, Alex.
Yes, and thank you, Alex, and thank you, Brookline Booksmith, for hosting this wonderful event. And thanks to Serena for writing this very elegant and very urgent book. And Alex just mentioned the incredible complexity and breadth of this crisis. And I wonder if we could just start with a few numbers. Can we talk about the extent of the human crisis of which you speak?
Sure, the numbers can feel really overwhelming. So by the end of 2019, there were 79.5 million people that the UN classifies as forcibly displaced. And of that, almost 80 million, 25 million are considered to be refugees in need of a new home. So these are people who have fled the borders of their state, they fear persecution, and they believe that they cannot go back to their home countries and live safely. So they're across the border somehow and trying to survive and are asking for international aid. Now, I say elsewhere that, it can seem like a lot, like 26 million refugees, but on a planet of 8 billion people, many people have theorized that actually it's not it's not as overwhelming a number as it might initially seem to be. What's missing, of course, is the political will, and a political will that doesn't exist in part because many people aren't fully aware of what refugees are going through as they try to get refuge around the world.
And you describe 70 or 78, almost 80 million people who are displaced, but not all of those are refugees. So can you refine just a little bit by what we even mean by the term refugee? Because that's a great deal of human suffering that then gets whittled down to the official term of what refugee means.
Yeah, absolutely. So 79.5 million people, the majority of those, 46 million of them, are internally displaced people. So these are people who the UN considers to be in a refugee-like situation. That's the phrase they use. But they have not crossed a border, so they have not left their country officially. So the UN can try to help them as best as they can. Other NGOs can try to help, but they only have as much access to them as the country that's hosting them will allow them to have. So they're in a way a very, very precarious situation. But and then, there are about 4 million asylum seekers in addition to that. So people who are considered to be refugees are in a particularly unique situation because they are asking for help from the international community. Their countries have said that they will not help them. In fact, if you send them back, they will persecute them, will torture them, they will rape them, they will kill them. So they are at the mercy, if you will, of the international community. So 1951 is the year the Refugee Convention is written and passed in the UN, and this is the piece of international law that defines a refugee as a person who has crossed a border and fears persecution on the basis of one of 5 grounds: race, religion, nationality, membership in a social group, or political opinion, and is unable or unwilling to avail themselves of the protection of their home state. So you're right that this is absolutely a very narrow definition of who a refugee is, and one that is only used by a handful of states. In fact, it's only used by what are called resettlement states like Canada, the US, various countries in the European Union and Australia, in order to figure out who is permitted to be resettled in their countries. Who is not included: people fleeing war, people fleeing extreme poverty, people fleeing private actors, so-called private actors, such as gangs, or violent husbands. So in Central America, many women in particular who are fleeing their home countries and coming to the US to request asylum are in fact fleeing abusive husbands, but husbands who are so abusive they believe that their lives are threatened by them. And the government's not willing to protect them. That's the key feature, of course. Domestic violence exists everywhere, but in certain countries, women have absolutely no protection from the brutality of their abusers. So do they count as refugees? Unfortunately, it's very arbitrary. Some years, yes, some years, no. Some countries, yes, and some countries, no. The US, for example, had a precedent that said that women seeking asylum due to domestic violence would be considered refugees. And the Trump administration, of course, rolled that back. So if you had the misfortune of being a woman crossing the border in the last 4 years, you would have been denied asylum, even though you would have been in the exact same situation as somebody who would have gotten asylum a few years previous.
And could you define asylum? Because asylum is a little bit different and it's an even narrower category than refugees. And we've seen recently that people who are seeking asylum are actually removed back across the border, at least in terms of recent policy in the United States, and put in Mexico. And I'm not certain that everybody is aware of what the legal implications of that are, or what we're implying about asylum seeking.
Sure. So an asylum seeker is somebody who would like to be recognized as a refugee, but rather than just crossing a border and waiting for a country to resettle them, they go directly to the country that they would like to be considered a refugee in. So to be an asylum seeker, you have to be physically present on the territory that you want to claim asylum in, which is why you see people taking these very dangerous journeys across the Mediterranean, across deserts, in order to physically be present in the United States, for example, or in Italy or in Greece. And asylum has a funny legal status because asylum seekers actually have one of the strongest rights in international law, namely the right of non-refoulement. And what this means is that if an asylum seeker shows up in your country and claims asylum, the country is not allowed to kick them out of the country and send them back to their home country or a different country until they've assessed whether or not the asylum seeker has a legitimate claim to persecution, has a well-founded fear of persecution, as the phrase goes. So that means you have to allow them to stay in your country, you have to give them a hearing, and only then, if you've found they don't have a legitimate claim, can you send them back. If they do, you're obliged to let them stay. What this has meant, as countries increasingly are skeptical about asylum seekers, are fearful of the numbers of asylum seekers that are crossing into their countries and trying to ask for help, is to prevent them from coming in the first place. And the way they do that is through what's called deterrence measures. So they try to deter would-be asylum seekers from making these difficult journeys by making the journeys more difficult, more deadly, and then imposing very harsh, awful conditions on the people who are able to make it to their country. The most notable example of this, of course, is the child separation policy in the United States, which is unique for many reasons. I mean, it was a unique kind of torture that was inflicted on asylum seekers, and unique also because the government was very open about it being a deterrence measure. They were very clear that if we don't be as brutal as we can with asylum seekers, they'll keep coming. But if we take their children from them, they'll get the message that, you know, you shouldn't come to the United States. You shouldn't bring your children over. The Remain in Mexico policy is another version of deterrence where rather than being allowed to stay in the United States, where maybe you have some family connections or maybe you will be able to be helped in the shelter system or with the NGOs here, you're forced to go back to Mexico to wait for your claim, but you're not given any kind of aid. So these informal camps have opened along the border to host asylum seekers, largely from Central America, who have come to the United States and then are sent back to Mexico, where very often the very gangs that they're fleeing from operate with impunity. So they've been sent back into these extremely dangerous, extremely impoverished circumstances in order to wait for their asylum hearing. But of course, communication is very bad. People end up missing their hearings and so forth, not because they're illegitimate or they don't want them, but because they just simply can't get the communication is so bad at that point. And so they end up losing their opportunities to claim asylum in the US.
And your book, I think, does a wonderful job of extricating these two very different perceptions of the humans who are at the center of this. That on the one hand, you call it a sort of two-part crisis or two halves of the crisis. The first crisis is from the perspective of receiving nations, largely Western nations, and then the second half is the human crisis on the other side, which, you know, and this division between the perception of the illegitimacy that you describe, which makes almost the definition of a refugee or an asylum seeker as somebody who is illegitimate, illegal. I mean, we even use the noun illegals in ways that have no moral basis and no legal basis most of the time, but that are fed by a certain fear that comes out of a sense of the first crisis, which is that of the nations to which these people are turning for assistance. Can you say a little bit about that division as you define it?
Absolutely. Before I answer that, let me just say something that I should have said when we were talking about asylum, which you reminded me of, which is that there's a widely recognized universal right to seek asylum. So this is enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So all human beings have a right to seek asylum. Countries don't have an obligation to give it to you, but you have an obligation to allow people to make a claim to asylum. And this includes people who have crossed the border without authorization, in other words, illegally, to claim asylum. That is, according to international law, that shouldn't be held against somebody who is seeking asylum.
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it is a human right.
It's a human right, exactly.
Good or bad, legal or illegal under law, it is a moral claim for all humans.
Right. So anytime you hear something about an illegal asylum seeker, please know that there's no such thing. If you are genuinely claiming asylum, you are by definition legal because you are exercising a universal human right to do that. But let me say a little bit about the two crises that I talk about in the book. So as you mentioned, the first crisis, I think, is the one that we experience, those of us who live in Western countries and see asylum seekers coming in increasingly large numbers, arriving at our borders, or see these crises, abroad and feel it as a threat to our sovereignty and threat to our immigration policy and a threat to our security. Or a threat to our economic stability. It seems like they're coming in such large numbers, they need so much help, or they are potentially terrorists and criminals and sexual predators, and we must be protected from them. Either way, it's often depicted as a crisis for us, for our countries, and for our policies. And this is often how the global refugee crisis is talked about. And what I wanted to do in the book is to ask readers to shift perspective and to think about what it might mean for them if they were forced to flee their home country. What does it mean to seek refuge in the 21st century? And the three outcomes that the international community has promised refugees don't really exist. So the first outcome is to be able to return home, voluntary repatriation. But fewer than 2% of refugees are actually able to avail themselves of that outcome in any given year. The second outcome that we're told refugees should be able to have access to is to integrate in countries where they find themselves. So you cross a border into a neighboring country and you begin your life there. You go to the local schools, you go to the local hospitals, but that also isn't the case. And there's so few refugees who are able to integrate that the UN doesn't even keep data on this. And the third option is resettlement. And this is one that the US has played a large role in since 1980 and has resettled large numbers of people. And we do it, and it's very, very important. But you would think that this was the solution for refugees, the way that most refugees gain refuge. But even in a really good year, even in our best year, we've resettled less than 1% of refugees. And a fraction of that, of course, over the last 4 years in the United States. So it's never actually been a solution for refugees since the modern refugee regime has been in place. So what options do you have if you're a refugee? You have three options. The first option is to go to a refugee camp where you register with the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. You're given food and some shelter, but you're largely denied autonomy. And this is something refugees say as being extremely difficult. You're not allowed to work. You're not allowed to move around. You're not allowed to decide whether you'll go back to your home country for a little bit and visit your grandmother who's dying and then come back. So you're denied the ability to determine the course of your life in important ways. And you might think, well, this is not terrible. It's not great, but it's a refugee camp. You can just stick it out. But of course, refugees are refugees not merely for a few months, and actually not even for a few years, but on average for 17 years and getting closer to 25 years if you're fleeing war. So that's your first option. And for many refugees, you think, this is unbearable. I can't live in a refugee camp for decades. I can't raise my children this way. So they choose instead the second option, which is to go to an urban area and live informally, which is to say without any international help, without any help at all in cities close to the countries that you live in. Fewer than 1 in 10 urban refugees have any kind of help from the international community. But you might choose this option because you can feel more in control of your life. You can work in the informal economy, you can live with co-nationals or friends, you can sort of survive according to your own wits. And for many, this is better, but it still is terrible. I mean, housing is terrible. Work is extremely precarious. Workers are very vulnerable to all kinds of exploitation. And what refugees say over and over again is that the worst part about it is that their children don't get an education. So we all know the struggles of, the anxiety about our children this year during the COVID pandemic. They're not going to be in school. Are they going to fall behind? This is so terrible. What about their social development? But for refugees, this is what they face for years and years, and the tragedy of watching your children grow up without any access to education. And because both of these options are so unbearable for most human beings, I mean, they're simply not options that any of us would choose if we were in that position. And as I detailed throughout the book, they fail to provide the minimum conditions for human dignity. This is why many people are choosing instead to take these extremely dangerous and often deadly journeys to seek asylum, almost always requiring the use of human smugglers to get on boats, to cross deserts, as I've mentioned. So this is about 10% of people who manage to go and seek asylum. And the price we ask them to pay is, in fact, very often their lives, but to put themselves into extreme vulnerability and risk all kinds of violence. And what I'd like readers to understand is that this is the global refugee crisis. Well over 90% of refugees remain in the global south, in the poorest countries in the world, either in underfunded, insecure camps or in urban squalor with virtually no help from the international community for somewhere between 17 and 25 years on average, which means for some people it's much longer than that, with a 1% chance of being resettled. And about, that's why 10% of people take their chances on being smuggled and risking torture, sexual assault, and death. And I think when we frame the refugee crisis in this way, I think this is what deserves our moral attention, and this is what we need to develop an ethical response to.
You have a wonderful, you sort of walk us through the imagining, sort of taking the romantic image of the Von Trapps crossing from Austria into Switzerland. In today's world, the Liberian Von Trapps, the Syrian Von Trapps, and you describe as they're a refugee in one place. If they try to seek work, they're an illegal alien. Then they're an asylum seeker, but maybe they have temporary protected status, which if revoked, then they become an illegal immigrant, and all of these changes of status. And you have some examples. I wonder if you could read us just a little bit the story, perhaps of Hasina or perhaps Fatia.
Yes, I'd be happy to. Let me just say, if there are any children listening, that these stories are a little bit explicit, so this might be a good time to turn on cartoons. So life in the refugee camp in Bangladesh is extremely difficult for Rohingya refugees like Hasina. Close to 1 million Rohingya refugees live in makeshift accommodation in the Cox's Bazar district, on sandy slopes that have been cleared of trees and other vegetation. Though they are grateful to be alive and safe from the violence of the Myanmar military, their daily life is challenging. Living in one of the most densely populated refugee camps in the world, they must navigate inadequate access to clean water, sanitary facilities, and healthcare. Food is also scarce. Though the UN and other aid groups provide food, usually rice, beans, and vegetable oil, the quantities are often insufficient and lack the nutrients that you can only get from fresh fruit, vegetables, and fish or meat. Not allowed to work, refugees are reliant on these handouts and grow increasingly malnourished. Even though the Rohingya have been subject to extreme violence in Myanmar for years, the Bangladeshi government insists that their stay in this camp is temporary and they will return soon to Myanmar. This is why Rohingya children are forbidden to enroll in school or receive instruction in their national language. Before Hasina was able to flee the violence in Myanmar, she was brutally tortured by the military. When they beat me, tied my hands, and hung my feet from a tree. I'm just trying to skip some of the more brutal descriptions in here. They pulled me down and gang raped me. I skipped over the worst of it. When she woke up naked 3 days later with stab wounds on the side of her face, she immediately began her journey to Bangladesh. When she arrived at a refugee camp, a friend asked if she would like a job in a garment factory, and she accepted willingly. The friend turned out to be a trafficker, and she was taken to a brothel and made to work as a sex worker. She works 7 days a week and gets about $1 per client. The poor pay and degradation is not the worst part for Hasina. Working as a prostitute, she has to relive the trauma of her torture by the military every day. Though prostitution is of course illegal and highly stigmatized, it's fairly common, especially at night when there's less security and fewer aid groups around. Pimping has become an easy and lucrative business with the influx of thousands of young, vulnerable female refugees. As one pimp said, "When the Rohingya girls arrive in Bangladesh, they don't know anything. They're so innocent, scared, and unaware. I tell these girls, look, nobody'll have you. I'll marry you. But we need money to get married. Rohingya girls are easy to convince. I have sex with all my girls. I take their virginity. Then I share them with my clients." So switching to another story. Life outside the refugee camp is scarcely less difficult for refugees who find themselves living informally in urban centers. Fatia Ahmed is grateful to be safely out of Syria, though she misses her life in Aleppo. In the old days, her husband drove a taxi and they were able to lead a calm, middle-class life, buying an apartment of their own. But in January 2013, her husband was killed by a piece of shrapnel from a bomb dropped by the Assad regime. Fatia, along with her 6 children and 2 grandchildren, decided to leave Syria after that and crossed over into Turkey. They live with 17 people in a tiny compound in the Turkish city of Gaziantep, near the Syrian border. Fatia shares a 12-foot by 12-foot bare room with her 4 daughters and 2 sons, where they eat, sleep, cook, and bathe. The compound is composed of 4 cinder block rooms with tin roofs that don't keep out much of the rain. There is no furniture. People sit on the ground or on a rock, and there are clotheslines everywhere. Fatia cooks on a tiny propane stove and is careful to keep food in jars or bags hung from the ceiling to make sure the rats don't get to it. There is a pit in the ground the 17 residents use as an outhouse. A, quote, nice Turkish lady allows them to live rent-free in the compound for the time being. Her sons are able to find work as day laborers, but Fatia and her children and grandchildren are mostly dependent on donations from Turkish citizens. She dreams about returning to Syria, but believes that if she does, her family will starve or be killed in the fighting. Quote, if we go there now, we will go to our death. For now, she will stay in Turkey and hope the generosity of the Turkish people continue.
One of the most powerful parts of your book, I think, is to really is the way in which you give the statistics of how much refugees contribute to the economies in which they are resettled. And there are points at which you contrast the fantasies and the sense of siege felt on one side of this crisis with the overall raising of all boats when they are successfully treated, handled, and given refuge, and the continuing trauma of what you just described being, self-perpetuating without, again, the political will that you describe. And so I woke up this morning, and you may have seen that in France they destroyed a refugee camp. And the police came in and they beat people and they destroyed their tents. And I just quote the deputy mayor of Paris, this problem is not one for the police to sort out. To think that we can resolve problems with billy clubs is totally crazy. As long as there is no available housing, there will be people living outside. And as long as there are people living outside, there will be camps. To think that we can solve it this way is foolishness. And it seems to me that is the way we're thinking about this a lot. And one of the lovely parts about this book is that you describe how simple the political will would be to address the structural revisiting of those kinds of urban camps, of the remote, ghettoized pens and cages in which we put people, and that grounding in fact of what it is that we have to fear or not to fear. Seems one of the most powerful undercurrents of your book. And so I guess, while the story this morning from France depressed me, I wanted to ask you about the hope that you provide, and if you have examples of that hope or the metrics by which you see this being remediated or addressed, if not ultimately or entirely remediated.
Yeah, people are sometimes surprised to hear how hopeful I am about the situation for refugees for a few reasons. One reason is that there's no shortage of creative ways we could be helping refugees. And in fact, there's a widespread agreement that our current way of aiding refugees in refugee camps by warehousing them, putting them away, or ignoring them in urban centers is not only cruel, but it's expensive. It's a really inefficient use of resources in order to help refugees. So one thing I outlined in the conclusion of the book is some of the various things we could be doing that would be no more expensive, but would be a matter of changing our perception of refugees. And one thing that I try to stress is that it's important to include refugees' voices, include them not only as sort of symbolic, as figurative in our decision-making process, but actually include what they want and what they say they want in our response to refugees. And what they say they want over and over again is autonomy, the ability to take care of themselves, not merely to be taken care of by the international community indefinitely. So they would like to work, and people have proposed all kinds of creative public-private partnerships that would encourage countries in the global south, businesses there, to hire refugees and sort of support the local economy as well as hire refugees and get access to trade routes and markets and so forth in return. So instead of helping refugees, we allowed them to trade with us, companies that hire them to trade with us, as a way of shifting our perceptions of how we're helping refugees. They also would like things like Wi-Fi and cash. And it turns out that cash is the most effective means of providing aid to people. But somehow we have it in our heads that they need to be passive, we need to take care of them. So there were all kinds of very interesting creative solutions, I think, that people have put forward that we could be supporting and promoting. And we have a chance, of course, with this new administration to really ask for a kind of moral leadership around refugees. I say, for example, that we ought to be continuing to resettle refugees at the numbers we were aiming for under the Obama administration, roughly around 100,000, 125,000 a year, which again turn out to be a net economic investment that turns out to repay us tenfold for our investment in refugees and the long-term economic benefit. So we should be encouraging that, but we should also be encouraging other countries to resettle refugees. There's no reason why middle-income countries can't be part of the resettlement process in a way that they've kind of been excluded for. So they need to be sort of brought in and encouraged and to make this part of our foreign policy. If we really believe that refugees deserve the minimum conditions of human dignity, there are all kinds of ways we could be engaging in that in order to do that. And I think it is really a multi-pronged solution. So I think resettlement, for some, is the only answer because they're too vulnerable to stay in refugee camps or to stay in the global south. For others, they would actually like to stay in the global south and to stay in the countries closest to their homes so that they can go back. And we ought to be facilitating ways of helping that allow them to achieve the minimum conditions of human dignity. But if you'd like, the other reason I have hope is because of the incredibly brave human beings who put their lives on the line to research and write about refugees. I mean, so much of what I've learned about refugees have come from journalists who have gone and lived with refugees in refugee camps and other, very dangerous situations. And then other everyday people who encounter refugees. And instead of saying, tear down the camp, it's inconveniencing me, go the other direction and actually sacrifice quite a lot. Shall I read from that passage at the end?
Yes, and I just wanted to say, you also framed this. I think the real message is that this really has to be a matter of political will, which operates at the level of governments and operates at a collective level, but that individuals can contribute by changing those norms, by pressing those norms. And Canada provides one, but the individuals Canada welcomes people into their homes, as I recall, or they did a very successful program which experience with refugees generated its own sense of pressure upon political.
Yes. Yeah, Canada has a private partnership scheme. So where you get together, I think it's something like 10 people. You can be friends, you can be a church group, and you agree to sponsor a refugee for a year. And you have to put up a certain amount of money, like several thousands of dollars. You have to show that they have a place to live for a year. And once you do that, you can sign up for this program and sponsor a refugee, and it's independent from the program that the government runs. But what the effect this program has, as you exactly point out, is to change the perception of refugees amongst average everyday Canadians. Because now you have people really invested in refugees and the refugees who are brought over. And once they come over, they tend to really thrive because they're immediately brought into a community and they have all kinds of support for their children, for language, and so on. So it's really changed how, and then because you have at least 10 people committed to each refugee, you have like these sort of communities that have sprung out that are now, very much committed to helping more refugees and helping other refugees. And during the Syrian crisis, you'd read these really, in the US, like, keep them out, they're dangerous. And in Canada, you'd read these stories about people who had empty apartments and they were learning Arabic so they could welcome their Syrian family when they arrived, and they couldn't wait for them to get there. So you're absolutely right that the different ways we respond politically is constructive, but it starts from about the demand of citizens that we do better for refugees, and that it in turn shapes the population, shapes citizens and their perception of refugees once they're integrated in the community and they get to know them and it becomes part of life and it becomes a very positive experience.
And you have some very eloquently written examples of that. I wonder if you'd read that.
Sure. This is towards the end of the book. And I draw on Hannah Arendt and I say we have to avoid both reckless optimism and reckless despair. Right? We can't think that, we'll just do a few things and this problem will end. And at the same time, we shouldn't think, this is too big, we can't do anything. So how can we mediate between these two feelings? Eric and Philippa Kempson moved from Greece to England to enjoy the beautiful climate and weather. When refugees started showing up on the beach in front of their house, they reacted not with resentment at people spoiling their peaceful life, but by becoming first-line responders. They kept an eye out for boats arriving and provided voyagers food, water, and clothing. This assistance was not offered by everyone. Some Greeks even threatened the Kempsons for helping refugees. The mayor of the island of Kos said that they should do nothing to help asylum seekers, not even offer a cup of water. The Greek government located asylum registration centers 40 miles from the shore where refugees were landing. And not only was there no transportation to the centers, it was illegal until late 2015 to give asylum seekers a ride. Anyone caught helping in this way could be accused of human smuggling. But the Kempsons were undeterred. Quote, "When you see a 2-week-old child with people with feet cut and people who haven't eaten for days, you can't do nothing," Eric explained. In November 2015, this is a different story, Derek Volz and his partner Mario invited a group of 24 refugees to live with them in their home in Berlin. At the height of the crisis, many Germans were worried about the cultural changes refugees from predominantly Muslim countries would bring to Germany. Many friends and neighbors in Berlin responded to Derek and Mario's act of generosity by posting insulting letters on their front door or by yelling death threats on the street. Friends worried that because they were gay, these Muslim refugees might even kill them in their sleep. But no one wanted to kill them, and no one insulted their sexual orientation. The most difficult thing for them was that the refugees used a lot of sugar and salt. Quote, "So we bought it at the market and that was that." End quote. The real disappointment for them was the reaction of their fellow Germans who acted, quote, "as if we don't have a responsibility in the world's happenings," Derek wrote in a blog post. Hans Breuer was a father of 2 in Austria where he worked as a shepherd, herding his sheep across the countryside. When he learned what was happening to refugees in Eastern Europe in the summer of 2015, he knew that he had to help them. He learned that Hungary put refugees in cages and camps and fed them like animals. So he went to Hungary with the aim of helping refugee families get to Austria, where they could continue on their journey. Hans would meet refugees at the train station in Hungary, then drive them to Austria. If police came by, he would hide the refugees under a blanket in his back seat. He risked years in jail for doing this. Hans is Jewish and spent his life hearing stories about Jews escaping in creative ways from the Nazis. Hans's father was a dissident who fled Austria for Britain before the war. Quote, "It makes me cry again and again if I think of my father, of his situation and of other immigrants, and I put it together with these people. There's too much similarity between these two situations, one 70 years ago and one now. And one last story. In 2018, the Italian government passed a bill that punished rescue boats that brought migrants to Italy without permission with prison sentences of up to 20 years. The new law was at the front of the mind of Carlo, a Sicilian fishing boat captain, when he heard the cries of about 50 migrants aboard a rubber dinghy off the coast of Libya. When he realized they had capsized and were in danger of drowning, he gave them food and water and coordinated their transfer to the Italian shore. Quote, "I'd be lying if I told you I didn't think I might end up in prison when I saw that dinghy in distress," he said. Others in similar position have made the same decision. Pia Klemp and Carola Racletta are two German sea captains who also chose to defy what they saw as unjust law and risk imprisonment by rescuing migrants at sea and bringing them to Italy.
So much, Serena. I think we're going to turn to questions if there are questions at this point.
Great.
All right. All right, we do have some great questions actually, so let me just pull that list up. All of them really complex and interesting, so thank you guys for sending those along. Starting with Kaleem. Professor Parekh, what do you think are some of the main misconceptions that the average person living in the developed world has about refugees and the global refugee crisis?
Thanks, Kaleem. Kaleem is a student in the PPE program. Great to see you, Kaleem. So, I tried to tackle some of these in the preface to the book. The biggest one in the US is that refugees are somehow terrorists. Somehow I say, but I mean, of course, this was the rhetoric around the Republican primary in 2016, and it was an attempt to make refugees seem as scary as possible so that the candidates could protect us from them. But in fact, there is no group of people in the United States that have been more thoroughly vetted than refugees. In order to be a refugee resettled in the US, you need to undergo somewhere between a 2 and 5 year screening process with dozens of intergovernmental agencies. And this includes hour-long interviews in your home country before you even have a chance to board a plane and come to the US. And by the time you're interviewed, the intelligence officers know you so well that they can ask specific questions like the following, which is a real question. Okay, you say you were raped. How many stars were on the jacket of the military officer that raped you? You say your brother fell off the boat and you stayed on and survived. How did your brother, or you fell off the boat too, but you survived. How did you swim the 1.5 miles from this point to the coast? So they know everything about refugees. They know you in very detailed ways, which is why since the refugee resettlement program has begun in the United States since 1980, there have not been any terrorists that have, quote unquote, snuck into the United States. There have been 4 or 5 out of the millions of people, 3.2 million refugees that we've resettled in that period, who have tried to finance terrorism in other countries. But again, this is a fraction of the percentage of refugees. So there's no reason to believe that refugees are terrorists. 2 other myths that persist often in the United States and in Europe as well is that refugees are more likely to be criminals and refugees are more likely to be sexual predators, or are in fact sexual predators. The myth about criminology has been thoroughly debunked for decades by criminologists. And in fact, it's the opposite. Immigrants and immigrant communities are much more likely to have a lower rate of crime than native-born populations. So again, there's no data to support the fear that refugees are criminals. And the same goes with sexual predators. A lot of it is the xenophobia and racism, these different tropes that were taken up and repeated over and over again to the point where people started to genuinely believe it. And I think one of the maybe less obviously pernicious things people believe is that they are economic drains. Surely it must cost a lot to do all that screening. When they come here, they have nothing. it costs us too much. We can't possibly afford to resettle hundreds of thousands of refugees. And in fact, that the opposite is the case. And we know this in a very ironic way. The Trump administration commissioned a report by the Department of Health and Human Services in order to, what they thought was going to be to support their view that we should end resettlement of refugees because of how much it costed. And in fact, they show that over a 10-year period, refugees contributed billions of dollars to the economy. So they were a large economic contributor, not a net economic drain. Refugees tend to integrate very effectively. Within one generation, their children tend to do as well or better than native-born children. So all of those fears, which are very politically advantageous for people who would like to take advantage of them, turn out to not have a basis in reality. And I wish people would understand this more deeply, because I don't think we can start to talk about morality and an ethical response to refugees when people's sense of fear is so heightened, and they fear refugees. And of course, you can't talk about how we should help them if you're in a state of anxiety around them. So I hope people read the preface and can lower their anxieties about potential refugees.
Let me see. An anonymous attendee asks, the cost of resettling refugees from places like Syria and Myanmar and countries like the US and the UK is very high in comparison to resettling refugees in countries that are geographically close and less expensive to do so. Do you think there's a moral case to be made that we shouldn't be looking to relocate refugees in developed countries at all, just based on a cost-effective level?
No, I don't think so at all. I don't think it's either or. I think we should be doing both. And I want to stress that we absolutely ought to be encouraging many other countries to resettle refugees and to integrate refugees, but not because I think the refugee resettlement program in the US and Canada, et cetera, ought to be defunded. I think, there's a question of how we allocate resources, but I think we should be doing both of those together. There's a really strong moral case for having a refugee resettlement program. And the case is that it's hard for the US to say to a country like Turkey, like Lebanon, like Kenya, like Ethiopia, please do a better job taking care of your refugees, when we ourselves are not willing to put skin in the game and show that we in fact care about refugees and we are going to be investing heavily in refugees. This is sometimes called humanitarian diplomacy. And if what we want is the US to be a moral leader on refugees, which is what I would like us to see, we also need to play a role in it. And I also don't think from a cost-effective point of view, it actually makes sense. There are some refugees who simply cannot be helped except by resettling them in countries that are able to take care of them. So I think we should be doing both.
All right, we have a couple of people asking about individual action. So an anonymous attendee says, I think you make a pretty compelling case for what countries can do for the global refugee community, but what can we do as individuals to help? And do we have an obligation to do so?
I do think we have an obligation to do so. I think the strongest obligation is towards citizens. And I think we can think of this in a twofold way. As Pat mentioned, my argument is actually that the global refugee crisis is a structural injustice. So it's a large-scale harm. It's an injustice that fewer than 2% of refugees actually can get refuge. But I don't think it's caused by the intentional actions of any one country or any one agent. So what we need in response to this is not merely more aid, but we really need to dismantle the injustice of the structures. And this is going to require all kinds of different interventions. And right now, the thing that we as individuals can be doing is to try to understand the structural injustice so that we can advocate for better policies, so that we're not just focusing on only resettlement, but we're also focusing on how refugees are taken care of, who are in refugee camps, who will remain in refugee camps and won't be resettled in the US. And for those of us in the US right now, we're going to have a huge job to play in countering what will inevitably be the really xenophobic rhetoric that's going to happen as soon as the Biden administration's plans around refugee resettlement and ending the Remain in Mexico policy and increasing asylum. As soon as that starts happening, we're going to again hear about how dangerous refugees are and how terrible it is and what a burden it is. And the more we can arm ourselves with information, statistics, data, but also stories and compassion and understanding, the better positioned we'll be to really push for this case that refugees matter and protecting the dignity of refugees is in American interest.
This actually leads nicely into a question we have from Carol, which is Tony Blinken, just nominated as Secretary of State, seems to have a profound understanding of many of the difficulties encountered by refugees. What do you anticipate the Biden administration will do to solve some of the problems you've discussed? Thank you, Carol.
Yeah, thanks, Carol. There's a video going around of Tony Blinken on Sesame Street explaining refugees, and it is the most touching thing, especially in contrast to, of course, Mike Pompeo, who his cold, dead heart does not seem to have any human compassion. Pardon that little political moment. So Tony Blinken does absolutely seem to have a very strong understanding of both the political challenges of refugees and the challenges for refugees themselves. So in a way, he understands both crises. What is the Biden administration going to have to do? So one thing they've said is that on day one, they're going to end the Remain in Mexico policy, and they're going to end the policy around so some of the deterrence policies that I've described that have been so incredibly harmful and dangerous to asylum seekers. And I think they're going to get a lot of pushback, and they're going to get a lot of pushback on the level of criminality, supporting, quote, illegal immigrants. And I think how they frame this to the general public is going to be extremely important. And I think he's a really good communicator. By all accounts, he's very good at articulating what he's doing. And I feel like this is going to be a very important part of undoing a lot of the damage of the last 4 years. It's not just undoing it in policy, but really communicating how what was being done was harmful not only to refugees and asylum seekers, but to our country, to our image of ourselves, and frankly to the global community, which shares in the burden of taking care of people who have been forced outside of their country. So I'm very hopeful about what this administration, the priority will place on refugees. And I'm also hopeful that they'll be able to really think about the messaging to the American public about refugees and asylum seekers. So we don't have 4 years from now this rhetoric around them being terrorists and criminals and sexual predators.
I actually have a question myself, which is essentially, I think it's fairly commonly understood that climate refugeeism is going to increase as time goes on. So I'm wondering, what do you see as the sort of necessary preparations on a country by country and global level to be ready to not only handle people who are being forced out of their places of origin now, but the increasing numbers that are likely to happen as climate change increases?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's currently no international agreement on climate refugees. There's no large-scale agreement about a definition for climate refugees. There's no sense of who has responsibility based on what or what should happen to them. So it's a very, very challenging situation. And I think, we sometimes think of climate refugees as people whose, islands are going under the seas, people in the South Pacific for, due to various changes. There's an increasing rain and they'll be flooded. But the perhaps more challenging situation is going to be the way climate change subtly affects people. So Pat and I were talking earlier about the way the Syrian civil war is thought of as a civil war. Of course, it's political, it's religious, it's ethnic. But in fact, what underlies it was the drought in Syria a few years prior to the conflict breaking out. So in many ways, Syrian refugees are at least in part climate refugees. And we have at the moment no preparation for how to either deal in practice with them or even how to articulate what might be the moral basis that we have a responsibility for. So to connect this to the last question, in a certain sense, the Biden administration, with its increased focus on climate change, may see climate change policy and refugee and asylum policy as dovetailing at a certain point, that we will start having to think about the implications of our current and previous policies around climate and the impact that it's going to have on people around the world. Now, unfortunately, of course, most of the impact is going to be felt by people in the poorest countries. So what I've been talking about in terms of how do we support countries where refugees live will be a bigger question when it comes to climate refugees. So all of the same features, I think, that currently we need to figure out morally about refugees will come again into play when we talk about climate refugees. But as you said, Alex, in a much larger numbers and in a much more intense way.
From Inal, we have a question of how do we morally respond to refugees who are internally displaced, like Palestinian refugees in the Gaza Strip, who are not allowed to leave?
The question of Palestinian refugees is a really, really challenging one. And they are actually under a different branch of the United Nations. So they're under UNRWA instead of the UNHCR. And I think that that represents the difficulty in talking about Palestinian refugees, because in a certain sense, they would like one solution, namely to return to Israel. They want the right of return. On the other hand, how their living conditions in the Gaza Strip are absolutely morally reprehensible. How we intervene in that, how we play a role in that is perhaps the most complicated situation in the world because of the way the various political stakes have been articulated in it. So I don't know the answer to that. Other conflicts where they're internally displaced people are in a way simpler because you just have the government to deal with. You have one government in order to get in aid and to order to access people. And this is by diplomacy. And this is the only way that this can happen. So organizations like the Red Cross, which have historically been apolitical, are able to work with governments. But of course, people have pointed out there's no such thing as apolitical aid. And if you're in a civil war, giving help to your perceived enemy is still help, no matter how it is. So I don't know the answer. I wish I had a better solution for that. I think, though, that seems to me an intractable political problem. How do we help internally displaced people? The reason I think the question of refugees is more of a moral problem, as well as a political problem for sure, but it has a moral dimension to it because they are vulnerable to our decision. If we say, nope, we're not going to help you, it's tantamount to a death sentence for them. So they have made themselves vulnerable to our decision. And as a result, we have to take seriously the implications of how we choose to respond or not to respond to refugees and asylum seekers.
So we're just at about 8 o'clock, which I think means that it's about time to wrap up. This has been a really incredible discussion. And I know a lot of people who are here in the event are grappling with the idea of helping as individuals in what is truly a massive issue. So Valerie asks whether you have any suggestions of groups, especially that people can give to, who can efficiently and faithfully get funds or supplies to refugees.
Yeah, I noticed, Kaleem, you wrote give directly in the chat box, which is terrific. I like a lot, I mean, there's some controversy over, how we should donate our money to whom, but I actually like a lot of the big refugee organizations because they help refugees directly and they do a lot of advocacy work on the groundwork to try to encourage, integration and to encourage countries to change their policies around refugees. So I think the IRC is doing a great job around that. Oxfam America does a lot of work with refugees as well. And Partners in Health is an organization that's very effective in giving health care to refugees and asylum seekers, both at the US border and around the world. So there are, again, lots of great organizations doing a lot of great work. I think if you want to make sure your money gets to a refugee, probably Give Directly is a good way to do it. If you want to support healthcare organizations, Partners in Health is a great organization, Doctors Without Borders, of course. And I like the IRC because they help refugees on the ground, but they also work to undermine these larger structural problems that I talk about.
All right, thank you for that. And thank you so much for this entire discussion. If anyone has not yet purchased the book, we'll send you out an email that has the link on our site. We would love it if you bought it from us. It's a great guide and a great illustration of the individuals and the great scale of this issue. So thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you so much to Professors Parekh and Williams for joining us. And I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful evening. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Alex. And thank you, Pat. And thank you, Ed Booksmith.
Good night.